Good morning. I want to start off by thanking Dr. Sean Joe for his hard work, his dedication, his commitment, his vision, and for bringing all of us together here at Washington University. We appreciate and respect what you have done. Thank you, Doctor. I also want to acknowledge the staff of Better Family Life and the Urban League that are in the audience as well, because as we know, none of us could do what we do alone. We need a good team in order to implement what we do in the community. So if you all would please stand so that we can acknowledge you and thank you. And the Urban League is proud to be a part of this effort. And we are grateful for the opportunity and grateful for our partnership with Better Family Life because honestly, bluntly, in this 400-year journey of race in America since the first Africans came to this country, we have not fixed the racial problems in the United States. And so we have work to do, right? And if any one of us could have fixed it alone, they would have been fixed. But all of us working together have still not been able to fix the issue. So the question is, how do we collaborate? How do we come together? And how do we partner and provide the mechanisms for a bigger impact? Your goals by 2039 are amazing. And I think that they are ones that we all need to adopt, that we need to work together on, that we need to collaborate on, that we need to do our best to work together on. As James said, it doesn't make any difference who gets the credit, right? I see Halbert Sullivan in the audience and so many others who have done so much in this cause. And at the Urban League, whether it's a Head Start child from 6 weeks old on up to a senior citizen who is in their 90s, we work for African American men and women every single day with 100,000 clients, and we want to make sure that we can collaborate with everyone in here through Save Our Sons and through all of our other programs to be as impactful as possible, and then to also push for and advocate for public policy from the city, state, and federal governments that will impact the work that we do as well, so that it is a collective between our governmental friends, those of us in the educational world, and then the not-for-profits all coming together to collaborate with the corporate and business world to fund the things that are necessary to make St. Louis the type of city that we all want it to be. So I commit to you that we are a part of this vision. We want to be a major part of it, and we want to do everything that we can to have it succeed. Thank you.
I want to thank both James and Michael McMillan and the Urban League. The partnership is getting deeper and stronger. The theme is very simple. Can we lead together? That means you're doing something and leading in your area, but when we come together around a bigger vision, then we have something as an opportunity in St. Louis to lead together. This way, you know the small politics of ineffectiveness because you've seen it. When we put my leading against your leading and realize that we have not changed anything. So in the context of the conversation that we're having here regionally, can we be better together? Isn't that the goal? Right? For those who are visiting, please allow us that small indiscretion to enjoy that. And I don't say that because that's not a serious conversation. That is a very serious conversation. Homegrown and what we're doing collectively, because homegrown is us collectively, we're demonstrating the opportunity to do something better together. And it's really simple. If black males and black boys and young men are not part of that strategy, you cannot be better together. If you're not very overt in realizing that if you don't increase the upward mobility of that population over the next 20 years, so basically you're taking 2 generations, 12 to 29, multiplying it to try to get 4 decades of positive outcome. Our system is designed to do exactly what you have today. I'm just telling you, this is no, and it happened. It was designed, and we are all part of that process. So if this is not if this future is not what you want, and we'll talk about that in more detail, then I'm asking you to choose your preferred future. Choose your preferred future with your actions. Because there's no magic bullet. No, it happened and we were glorious. No. You know this is hard work, and I'm prepared to do that with you. So with that in mind, not to hold us up, I would like to, at this point, to bring up our first guest. I would like to invite David Shapiro, Anthony Smith, and Reverend Starsky Wilson to join us at the dais, please. And this was critically important. As you can see, we're pushing a little bit, so if I seem a little rushed, it's only because I'm trying to get us back on time. So I think we're there. And I thought it was important because, you know, as we're doing our work, sometimes we take each other for granted. Sometimes we take the talents and the resources that's here in St. Louis for granted, and I want to make sure that all our work is always understood that we're a part of a bigger movement. And I've invited David Shapiro, who's the CEO of Mentoring, the National Mentoring Partnership, and Anthony Smith, CEO of Cities United, and of course our local but international, one of our international leaders, Starsky Wilson, President and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, to really engage with us in a conversation that really put the work that we're doing in position and in context, and to talk about how there are national resources that I think we're now better organized to be able to draw on and partner with these organizations that are advancing boys and men of color work across the country. So this is my first time meeting them as well, so we met last night just to break bread and talk about the initiative a little bit more. The goal of today's conversation is to really help us understand the work that you have available, the work that you're doing, and more important, how do we put this homegrown St. Louis MBK work in context, and how can we better benefit from what you have to offer with your organizations, your mentors, and your colleagues. So I'm just going to open it up first for each of them to give a brief remark, and then we can engage in our group conversation. For the audience, I will turn to you to take a question, and there's microphones in the room, and I would only ask that you ask a question. I think it's important if you do have a statement, we will have time for that this afternoon. And we'll be able to do it also in our networking breakfast. So I understand that's important. So let me begin first by asking our out-of-town guests to give their opening remarks, and then will be followed by Reverend Starsky Wilson, and then we'll move right into our discussion. So, David.
Sure. Well, good morning. It's a great. Is it on?
It's on.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Otherwise, I'll do my Little League coaching voice. But I'm not a preacher's kid, so all I got is Little League coaching. But it's a great honor to be here, and I appreciate the staff and what they've put on, and everybody at the university for taking such good care of us. And I think James and Michael, with tremendous brevity, just came up here and sort of modeled for us what it looks like to collaborate and really try to change the game. I'll give you a quick sense of what Mentor is for those of you who don't know, and then sort of like how we come at this work. Try to do that in a couple minutes so I can get to Anthony, who's much more interesting than I am. But Mentor was created about 30 years ago, very much in a way, people sitting in a room just like this saying, we had this powerful intervention of mentoring. At the time, we really only had one organization, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Should I? Oh, is that better? There we go. Thanks. Anthony turned me off.
My bad.
I'll tell you. Travel the country with this guy, and he turns off my microphone.
I've heard it.
Yeah, he's already bored. Mentor was really started by folks who thought we have this powerful asset in our midst, which is what happens when we build bridges between humans and what happens when young people have supportive relationships. And there was a time, it was really born of the success of Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and you have a world-class local Big Brothers, Big Sisters, because they were practicing mentoring at scale. Across the country, had 200,000 or so young people matched in mentoring relationships, but there were very little other on-ramps in 1990, before the internet, believe it or not, to figuring out how to do mentoring in an evidence-based way and based on what folks had figured out. And so these folks, their line, which I love, and it's sort of where you sit today, they said you can't build skyscrapers without infrastructure. So their goal was to build the infrastructure of the mentoring movement. How do we undergird so that any human who wakes up or institution and says, I want to be a part of the calculus that gets more young people surrounded by supportive relationships, they had that guidance. That could mean figuring out how to start a mentoring program. That could mean putting in your zip code and finding a mentoring opportunity. That could mean getting some cultural humility and competency to figure out how to mentor and understand your place in privilege and your mentee's place as well. It could mean a lot of different things. And over the years, 30 years, it's meant a lot of different things. But that was really their sort of animating goal, was how do we build a mentoring movement in this country? How do we not leave relationships for young people to chance? We come at this conversation really in a few different ways. One, I think it's always important when we talk about my brother's keeper, because it looms so large, that people have been doing this work for hundreds of years, right? The president kind of gave us a North Star and used a platform, obviously, that is unique in the world and his position in the world, to shine a light on it and say we need to accelerate and amplify the inequities that face us. But we stand on the shoulders of folks who have been doing this work for a very long time and working very hard at it. And what we heard when we listened to voices and community leaders was that mentoring was a huge part of the solution. Young people feeling disconnected, young people not being able to see the things they can't be, families trying to get through the next hour, so it was harder to think a week, let alone a year out, families not being able to engage with certain institutions and needing more agency, and just listening to young people. I mean, in every sort of My Brother's Keeper town hall I've gone to, when you actually listen to the voices, you hear young people pretty profoundly saying, I would love to find relevant people in my life who would stick with me, see the best in me, no matter what happens, and help me navigate a hill that feels long to climb and places that feel behind a wall that I can't see. And so they kept, saying that. We kept trying to figure out how to respond. There are lots of mentoring programs across the country that are trying to do that every day. The question was, how do we do it with greater effect, with greater collaboration, and at greater scale? And so a lot of our efforts have been around, one, skill building. How do we make mentoring programs better at both critical race consciousness, at cultural humility and competency, and better at mentoring when the mentoring is happening from folks that are maybe not of the same background? But then also, how do we invite more people into mentoring in the movement, and how do we get more rigorous around it? So that's sort of been our work, is helping cities do those plans to figure out how to do this mentoring at scale, how to get that outreach, how to figure it out when it's with workforce or in education or around school discipline. There are a lot of different problems that can be solved with mentoring as a part of the equation. So we're not taking relationship for granted. So that's sort of been our work, and I'll kind of stop there and assume that there'll be other questions, but pass it on to my partner here.
Cool. So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Anthony Smith, Executive Director of Cities United. Really excited to be with you all. Coming from Louisville, Kentucky, which is where Cities United is headquarters, mainly because that's where I live and I'm raising a family, and did not want to move when I took on this gig. But it's also my hometown. It's a city that I love, much like the love that you all have for St. Louis in this room. Cities United was founded in 2011. Former Mayor Nutter and Landrews came together with Dr. Bell from the Casey Family Programs and was really looking for a way to support mayors on building different kind of strategies to keep our young black men and boys alive. So Cities United ultimate goal is to reduce the homicide rate of young black men and boys between the ages of 14 and 24 by 50% by the year 2025, right? So when you put the vision out, like I love you all's vision about 2039, this is what St. Louis is going to be for young black men and boys, and we're committed to that. And so they put this vision together and really was working together and recruited other mayors to say, mayors, we need to think about this work differently. It's not about law enforcement. This is not about locking folks up. This is really around how do we look at the root causes of violence and really start putting our resources and our energy in different places and not just always into the police department budget when we look at budgets. So our job is really to help mayors in their cities really create big tables like this and come up with different solutions to how we keep our young men and boys alive and how do we work together, mainly making sure that those young men and their families are at the table and at the center of the conversation so that they get to be a part of the solution building and be also a part of the work. So we support a network of mayors. We're in about 130 cities right now. We work with the mayors, their city lead, which is somebody from inside of the city that has direct access to the mayor. But also we work with young people between the ages of 18 and 24 in a fellowship that we have created to really help those young people become the next generation of those leaders, giving them the skills that they need, but also attaching them to a national network. So we believe that if you can really come to a table, spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on, what's happened, where are we losing young people at, right? Where's the first sign that we know we're losing a young person and putting them on the pathway to be a perpetrator, victim, or a witness to violence, and what does that look like and feel like? And then how do we start how do we start intervening there? So we believe in a two-pronged approach, right? One, we know a lot of young people are in harm's way today. How do we move them out of harm's way? How do we get the interrupter models or whatever it is that you want to put in place now? But then looking strategically, what's our long-term plan? What are we going to do for the long term to make sure the kids stay in school, make sure they have opportunities to live in safe and healthy and hopeful communities, and making sure that when they graduate school, there's opportunity, there's a job, right? Joe shared some numbers with us last night that talked about, and you all seen it, that talked about the number that average income is $11,000.
Yeah, that's in your brief report on the social mobility, if you want to follow.
Yeah, when you look at that going from the 80s at 30 into now at 2010, it's 11,000. We know we can't survive on 11,000, so there's side hustles, there's all these other things that we do to make sure that our families are taken care of. Because at the end of the day, most of us are trying to make sure that our families are taken care of. And if you're not giving me the opportunities to do that, I'm going to figure out a way to do that. And sometimes it's not what you like. So how do we make sure that we're saying that to mayors, and we're making sure that mayors understand differently? Because when you look across the country, most of the cities we're in, there's white mayors leading that city. And they're trying to figure out opportunities and solutions for folks that don't look like them, for folks who come from different backgrounds than them. So our job is to put them in rooms with those folks and really have those conversations so that we can come up with real solutions. But ultimately, saying how do we change the way that the city work with its partners to deliver the services and the goods that the community needs to survive and thrive. So we're really looking at city budgets, saying we know most cities put a third to 50% of their budget to public safety. When they're talking about public safety, and again, they said it last night, public safety is who we're trying to keep safe is mostly white folks, right? And making sure they feel safe. And that means then we're patrolling, and then we're actually kind of trying to control black and brown folks. And what does that look like and feel like? So it's a difference when we talk about public safety, and we're trying to redefine the narrative of what public safety means in the communities that have traditionally felt a different kind of a public safety approach to them. So Cities United is really focused on that. We believe that if we can figure that out, we can make sure that not just the young men, but their families also grow up in safe, healthy, and hopeful communities where everybody has an opportunity not just to live and survive, but actually thrive and live out their purpose and their dreams. So excited to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation with you all and the whole panel. I had not known what St. Louis was doing, but last night briefing and then today in this room has put you all on the radar totally different for me than I had thought before I came. So really excited to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Reverend Wilson, and Reverend Wilson, if you also could talk a little bit about what the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing is doing. I think this is a fabulous new institution that has been launched in St. Louis, and again, helping us to move this vision forward. So please.
Sure, will do. Good morning. Good morning. I begin with my deep appreciation for you, Dr. Joe, and my deepest apologies for my tardiness today. Thank you, dear Sister Risa, who perhaps ushered the spirit in a manner that we would not have anyway. So we're grateful. In this conversation, I really want to follow along to share a little bit about kind of supports and the broader framework of work that we have the opportunity to be a tentpole in from our philanthropic space here. And I'll begin with a little bit of storytelling. Just to get behind it a little bit, there are those who speak in this kind of boys and men of color work nationally of three different kind of phases of the work. There is an early phase where philanthropic institutions across the country were deeply investing in this work and created the containers and, quite frankly, a lot of the early investments that when we came to know of the second phase, which is the announcement of My Brother's Keeper, the kind of Obama-era phase of this work nationally, much of what we heard about was the aggregation of investments of philanthropies who understood that deep investments in boys and men of color across the country would pay off for the entire nation because they understood the rising demographic trends for the nation. They recognize that since that it is the case that today that the majority of children under the age of 4 are children of color. They know that in 2020, yes, there will be an election, but that will also be the year when the majority of children under the age of 18 in America are children of color. So they understood that trend more than 20 years ago and began to align philanthropic investments and to do the work not just of philanthropic investment, but also of philanthropic organizing so that they can transition into the phase that they were working on transitioning into in 2014, particularly in August of 2014, which was philanthropic advocacy. So it's one thing to invest, it's another thing to organize oneself. So the organization phase began to happen really intently a little bit over 6 years ago with the formation of something called the Executives Alliance for Expanding Opportunities for Boys and Men of Color. Those who had aggregated the resources that, quite frankly, can we do a little truth telling here? That, quite frankly, when MBK was announced broadly, it was the aggregation of those independent philanthropic investments, not state investments, that was really being announced. Yeah, right. And the Obama brand was brought to the conversation to lift it up, and it did a remarkable job of drawing people into the conversation who were not yet in it. Now I'll tell a little behind-the-scenes story. Can I tell a little behind-the-scenes story? If I can tell a little behind-the-scenes story that has to do with the partners around this table, Washington University, Deaconess Foundation, the United Way. August 9, 2014, we're trying to figure out what the hell is going on. My other partners wouldn't say what the hell is going on, but I'm the one talking right now. And we're trying to figure out what the supports are. We're trying to figure out what is our responsibility and what are the things that we are to do. And we're engaged in a conversation about something called Ready by 21, a cradle-to-career approach, collaborative approach aligned with the collective impact intent in St. Louis to advance opportunities for children and youth. And because of the immensity of the moment that we found ourselves in, we ended up in conversations with people in the Obama White House. We ended up being found in many ways by folks at the Executives Alliance, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, and being introduced to this wider network because there was not a member of the Executives Alliance in the state of Missouri. And so in many ways, similar to what Brother Smith found out today, our work was not necessarily being seen at a national level, but the crisis called for people to see us in a different way. In a parenthetical note, if anybody would know here, I'll just act like I'm in Bible study. I don't get the pastor anymore, so I get to ask some questions. Does anyone know where the initiative, so MBK was one thing, the My Brother's Keeper initiative. Then there was something announced called MBK Communities. Anybody know when and where that was first announced? It was first announced with the commitment of the mayor of Ferguson, James Knowles, in August of 2014. It happened after some behind-the-scenes actors in conversation trying to figure out how we would have a philanthropic response and an aligned response had been in conversation with the White House about announcing this initiative. It happened because city leaders in the city of St. Louis had already been a part of this conversation, coming out of work out of the Obama White House on reducing youth violence, and people had been connected to that work, and they wanted to come. Indeed, there was the planning, the early stages of planning for a convening here at Washington University to announce a national initiative and rollout called MBK Communities to align philanthropic investment around these issues in the midst of the uprising. Part of the challenge was this. At that time, other people were trying to figure out different things. While these philanthropic actors in the Executives Alliance were deeply aligned in partnership with the White House, they were also seeking to shift, to add to the toolbox of what was coming out of the White House, not just a focus on mentorship, but the reality that this table has to come together. It's not just about direct service and supports and mentorship, but rather we've got to have a policy conversation. And while those leaders were trying to shift that big ship that is at 1600 Pennsylvania, even with wonderful, remarkable friends in that office that some of us can remember.
And miss.
Getting into a public policy conversation, which would get us into a building power conversation, was a difficult thing to do. And so, ultimately, that convening in St. Louis didn't happen. The timing was still appropriate. And so, folks recognized that there were smaller municipalities around here, and you could perhaps get the same effect with the announcement if you found a smaller municipal commitment even though it wouldn't get the same region-wide impact. And so on a conference call with one of the members of the presidential cabinet was announced with the mayor and leader of Ferguson at the time, and still, the announcement of MBK Communities with the first commitment in this region being from the mayor of Ferguson. Wow. But that was an effort to align these things. And I mentioned Ready by 21 because what was laid out in that initial response on that day was really Ready by 21 repackaged. It was an aligned support for all children without express language for boys and men of color. It was the right collaborative approach without the courage to name and to frame and to be explicit about Black boys and young men. And the tension and dance continues for how to align philanthropic investments so that we might support community collaboration in order to advance policy with power on behalf of Black boys and young men. The Executives Alliance continues in that conversation, and others support it as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what that takes very briefly. Another table at which we sit is the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. Pleased and honored right now to chair that board. And what that's really about is trying to engage in watchdog activity with philanthropy. I'm inviting y'all to this, so that's why I'm being so specific. Watchdog activity with philanthropy. To invite philanthropy to make this promise. Number one, that at least 50% of investments from the philanthropies will go to communities that have been historically underrepresented and underserved. I know that sounds like a lot. You think you're being charitable, you're helping people. Of course, 50% now, a lot of money goes to big institutions and not to individuals, not to those who are deeply affected by these issues. Number two, to get philanthropy to invest at least 25% of its resources and community investments in what we call community-engaged strategies. What do you mean community-engaged strategies? Isn't all philanthropy community-engaged? We're saying at least while you're investing in mentorship, absolutely continue to do that. Invest up to 75% of what you do in mentorship. Invest 25% in public policy, community organizing, and systems change efforts. Why? Because the public policy work becomes conversation pieces that can be used to exploit public dialogue unless you also invest in building the power among the people who are affected by the issues to articulate and to make their space at the table. And so I want to be thoughtful, I want to be mindful of what Sean has asked me to do. He asked me, thank you, he asked me to talk about the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing, and I'll just talk about it this way. It's a space and a place that we find to be an appropriate collaborative conversation with this space and place. It's also committed to child well-being. This space and place, which deeply aligns us here at Clark Fox in the public policy conversations and roots us in the kind of research that is required to advance. That space and place in community on 1000 North Van Deventer is a space to build power to make the policy solutions happen. Last year, more than 13,000 people convened in that place, aligned around 4 deep policy commitments: justice and equity for youth, looking at the foster and adoptive care system and the criminal justice system, access, comprehensive access to health care, increased investment in early childhood education, and family economic mobility. And some of the folks who are in that space are doing the things to make the shifts happen. And so we mentioned just earlier public safety. We spent over 60% of the city of St. Louis's budget on public safety. 60%.
So,
much of that has to do with the medium security jail called the workhouse, where most of the people, over 80% of the people, have not been convicted of anything.
correct.
Rather, they're there because they do not have the resources to get out of jail, and they're predominantly black and brown. The cash bail system that keeps them there, that makes them lose their jobs, that turns them to the need for supports, places like Father Support Center, because they've been ripped from their homes and their communities, is an institutional systemic support that, as long as it exists, will continue to rob resources for social mobility out of our community, will rob young people of their fathers and their mothers, and will keep us having this conversation. So while it is nice to be thoughtful about these programs, while it is critically important to invest in things like the Amachi program, big brothers, big sisters, and matching young people with those who are impacted and are incarcerated, it is also critically important to break down the actual walls and to transform these spaces and places as well. In New York, where a former women's jail stood, the Novo Foundation and Ford Foundation are now building a collaborative women's center for supports and services. How might we allow that phoenix to rise where the workhouse lives right now, and where young Black, brown, queer organizers are trying to take us to that vision right now?
Thank you. Thank you. So we, which I just learned, realized that Ferguson was the origin of a different level of commitment to boys and men of color work. And then the energy of Michael Brown and the spirit of what his life meant and how we've all come to know him, Ferguson becomes another motivation for us to do something more transformative, focused unquestionably, unashamed, and very direct on Black boys and young men, and asking that question. So I'm even further heartened by that. So let me open it up a little bit. You heard about both the national resources and as well as the powerful local resources that we have here in you, Reverend Starsky Wilson. So let me just open it up to some key things, because first I'm going to go to Mr. Smith.
Yes.
So you work with mayors. We have lots of mayors. So one of the things that, because Homegrown takes a very geographic specific sort of strategy to move forward, I would love to hear how we might be able to work with you to work with our many mayors. Now, I know the fragmented systems of our mayors structure for some is something that we have to address because they see some weaknesses in that process, and they probably are some. But I see some strength in that disaggregated process where we can begin to go mayor to mayor, small city to small city, to do some deep collaborative work. So I'd love to hear how you think you would like to potentially collaborate with us in St. Louis to work with our mayors, and then two, what is it that we really need to know about the process of working with mayors that we have to better our skill set in order to be effective partners with them. And I raise that because we usually ask what do they need to do, but there's some things we need to understand about the politics and the nature of it, and there's a limit to what they can do, so we don't have higher expectations than what, they can actually do, so we can really stay focused and not be dissuaded.
Yeah, good question. I think the first question is how could we work with the multiple mayors? I think what could be really, really helpful is how do we bring them into the space and give them the same overview that you gave us last night? Okay. And really give them an understanding of what you all have been up to and what your vision is. Because a lot of times mayors are looking for spaces where they can just be a part of, right? They don't always have to have all the answers and solutions. And be real clear, we work with mayors and other elected officials because we're also we understand that mayors have a certain amount of power. But when you think about councils and aldermen and all of these other places where elected officials are, and even thinking about school board, right? Because I think partly what we always do sometimes, and in this work, is we forget school boards have separate budgets in most places and separate ways that they do stuff, and how that money is deviated impacts our young kids as well, right? So how do we pay attention to that? SROs, detentions, and all of that stuff, alternative schools. So we come in and really try to assess the wholeness of and looking at who all has access and resources and how do we help them think about reimagining how they reallocate those. So one, you all should probably bring them into a space and give them an overview just like you're doing today. Talk about your visions and giving them some ideas of how they can fit in, right? When you talk about these 60,000 young men, where are they in those cities and what are they doing in those cities? Giving them real clear plans and visions on that. But then two, partly how we work with mayors, for us, we've gotten to a place in Cities United where we started this conversation with mayors, but we're real clear that mayors come and go. And if people see this as a mayor's only kind of initiative, then it goes away when that mayor goes away, right? So the way you all have flipped it and started it with community and with institutions actually makes it more sustainable, right? Now you can say to the mayor, we've got a plan, we've got a vision, we've got resources. We need support and help now because you have access to policies, you have access to other things that we need support and help around. But I think that regional approach is smart also because it also takes it to a state level, right? Because at the end of the day, state impacts a lot of the stuff that happens when you talk about jails and detention centers. Most of those are state-led organizations, just happen to be in your city. And folks in the city gets to run them and be a part of it, but the way that they run and the regs come from the state. So really just trying to make sure that you're really, really clear about what level of government, is it an executive or a legislative, making sure that people understand what the mayor can really do. So I think making sure that if you're putting together a town hall, that you're also educating the folks around what the responsibilities of the mayor is and what's the responsibility for the council folks and what's the difference there, and then who do we hold accountable on those different ends. But I think, a big part for me is that once people sign on to Cities United, for us, that's also a way to hold them accountable.
Yes.
Because what you're saying is that you care about this issue, you want it to be different, and you want to work with community to create these long-term strategies and plans. So now community has this agreement that the mayors come into that they can now go back and do some kind of like bargaining with and say, how do we hold you accountable to this? We've got a vision for this, and how do we do that? So,
Thank you. Let me get some questions from the floor because I have my own, but I want to give you a chance to ask everyone on this panel a question. So if there's anybody has a burning question, we have one on top. So there should be is there a mic? Okay.
Mr. Wilson, you had mentioned policy with power. So two parts. Number one, can you elaborate on what that looks like? Number two, how can we begin to create that?
Great. Sure, thank you. So as we talk about, shameless plug, because I see Nicole Hudson over there on the side. I think we've got a really robust policy map in the Ferguson Commission report that I may be biased, but I think people should read it and spend some time with it. But I think part of what happens in that report is an idea of what some of the power, so when we start talking about building power, part of what you need is some shared analysis of the situation. And I think our community has done that work with 3,000 people investing 30,000 volunteer hours to say we've got a shared analysis of what some of the challenges are. And we've disaggregated some of the data that, of course, has been remarkable follow-up in the city of St. Louis from the mayor's office and the Equity Indicators Report in partnership with the United Way and others to say this is a shared picture of what our challenges are. My great concern in that, because Deaconess serves children, is that the lowest ranking in our equity indicators overall is for child well-being. So that implicates this space and the importance of this space. We start talking about the difference between those policy articulations. When we look at those reports, we begin the power calculus in that report when we identify who's accountable for what. So the first piece is a shared analysis. The second piece is power mapping. Who has accountability and authority? This kind of education that Brother Smith was talking about on what a mayor can actually do, what a school board can do. And once we've identified who's actually accountable for making the change, the question becomes, how do we orient the community with with a priority or a preference on people who are most deeply affected by the issues to get in contact with the people who have power to make the change. And some of that includes investment in just basic grassroots community organizing. Some of that includes investments in integrated voter engagement, meaning not just knocking on people's door when you want them to vote for something, but having deep year-round engagement with people so that you might do that work. Some of that's happening in our community through the organizing of groups like Metropolitan Congregations United. More than 40 congregations affiliated with the Gamaliel Network who are going out and educating people in pews and synagogues and mosques about issues related specifically to the school-to-prison pipeline in their current campaigns, but then also folks like the Close the Workhouse campaign, who are not only getting people released, but getting those people who are released to tell their stories and engage regularly in organizing. So it speaks to a consciousness and an organizing so that we might engage these issues. And finally, I'll say probably more briefly, it looks like democratic access and voice to impact policy decisions. And that's not just things that you see in election engagement, but it's also things like economic development. right? We got $8 billion worth of economic development happening in the city of St. Louis right now. The question is how much of that is happening with a market-driven approach and how much of that is happening with a community-driven approach. We know that market-driven approaches displace people disproportionately and change the demographics of a community. We know that community-driven approaches enhance things like affordable housing. And so when we're talking about appropriately funding the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, when we're talking about making more than 20% of transportation-oriented development connected to affordable housing, we're talking about impacting boys and men of color. And so I think getting engaged in that conversation, making sure that neighbors are a part of the calculus on what happens in a community from a development standpoint is also what that power looks like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, we're trying to show you can't see it because our technology is down this morning, so we made a makeshift, but I wanted to point because the Ferguson Commission calls for regional transformation and large-scale initiatives. You cannot do the same thing as we did before. The literature that we've been, and the studies we've been doing says there are things that's indicating that the region is headed in the wrong direction. I was going to show a little slide here that the level of income disparity between blacks and white is increased about 54%. That when you look at, and this is all in your report here, that's in your booklet, everyone. When you look at the changes, okay, so there's two different things. I'm changing here, realizing it's not changing there, because we're in that situation today. If we can go forward a little bit, Ruby, thank you. Keep going forward. Keep going forward, because I think I'm showing you, but you're not. Let's keep going forward. One more. Keep going. Right, next one. This is it. Okay? So I want to throw it back out. And again, if you have a question, please raise your hand, because Luther's right there. Robert is right there. So if you can give them a mic. There's one person right here, and then I saw Kimberly Birdwell over there. Is that when you look at the indicators of black male upward mobility, what it says is that when black males used to make $30,000 a year, these are working males 18 to 29, now making about $11,000 a year, a year. And would that translate into roughly $30 a day, which means 2 hours of a $15 per hour job is what they're earning. So now you got to deal with responsibilities of family, self-care, and everything else. So in this context, and you hear these national resources and conversations and strategies, we have to think about how do we actually impact this, because as you see it, we're headed in the wrong direction. So our principle is how can we lead together to head in the right direction? So mentoring has been identified as one of those key resources. Okay? However, mentoring at a life coach level is not enough. What more should we add, and how can we partner with you to add it? Anyone can talk, can take that.
Yeah, I'm always going to respond when someone says mentoring is not enough. So you set me up there, or I wouldn't be doing my job. So I think first of all we need to be really careful that when we're talking about mentoring, we know what we're talking about, because it's got a lot of different shapes and sizes, and it can lead to advocacy, economic empowerment, systemic change, a lot of the things we've been talking about. And that can happen on a personal level, from a mentor showing up with a young man, as I have at the polls, him finding out that he didn't fill out some card which makes him not registered to vote, and thinking he's got to turn away, but realizing, pushing a little bit harder against the system, and realizing he can fill out a provisional ballot. And when they figure out that he's actually eligible to vote, his vote's going to count. Or it can be in the triangle down in North Carolina, where to deal with disparities in school discipline, they created a mentor advocate program where adults could show up, non-familial adults would make a commitment to build relationships and show up for young people when there were discipline issues, because often discipline was being led to law enforcement because there was just no adult to walk that child out of the school. And kids who had parents who could show up for them because they had flexible jobs allowing them to show up were very much favored in that system, having nothing to do with the actual disciplinary action. So I just want to make sure we understand that there's a role for mentors to play as advocates.
I totally get it. I totally get it.
No.
One of the things we're talking about, though, David, is that In our vision here, we talked about last year, and it's got to be said, we want our mentoring to include sponsorship. We want you to sponsor black males. We want you to go out your way to do something different and tell me that you're privileging them. Right. So not only are you going to coach them, but you're going to open up a door to say, here's a job that we think we're going to make available for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I wanted to lift that up because I wanted to get your sense, because we have a lot of mentoring organizations and you have a lot of mentoring knowledge. So how can we work together to advance the mentoring science that's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you've got to realize is that, one, you've got to not sort of define mentoring as a bludgeon. You've got to define it as a scalpel. It's a relationship-based intervention that can wrap around a job, that can wrap around intervention in, criminal justice deferment. It's a relationship that says this person's going to keep showing up for you in whatever setting. That could be a 7-year-old around literacy. That could be around a summer job. So you've got to figure out how there's a researcher who has a great a phrase. She says that, mentoring is sort of the active ingredient. It's not the ingredient, it's the fluoride in toothpaste or the yeast that makes the bread rise. So you've got to think about how to integrate mentoring models and integrate training adults to be mentors and advocates in a variety of different settings to get to your goals. At the end of the day, and then I'll be quiet about it, but at the end of the day, the guiding light should just be, how do we uphold a covenant to young people that oftentimes has been broken? Not necessarily by their families, but by society in terms of who shows up and believes that there's greatness within them. I always tell this story about an 11-year-old who said, people only show up for me when I do something really bad or really good. And that's pretty much how the system responds to kids, worse for some than others. But we got to figure out how to disrupt that. I think mentoring can often disrupt that.
From the floor? Thank you.
Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for coming today. While I'm sitting here listening to you all talk, you all made me think about something. I see a lot of great leaders in this room. And one of the great things I know about HomeGrown STLs, they're all about collaboration. I'm also a board member with Ford through Ferguson, so let's put radical collaborations. So I'd like to know, how can leaders and the people they work with, and as well as their staff, reach out to the young men who might see you all as not the ones they want to talk to? And how do we build relationships that will catapult this $11,000 into an opportunity to thrive, as talked about on the sign here? How can we get our leadership to, as we talk about grassroots, how can we build those bridges, from the corporate to the streets, and all of us get off the streets and get an opportunity to thrive?
Let's have one responder, if you don't mind. You can choose from among you. And remember, how would I say, leadership that remembers and bring all conversations into the room so they can have alignment. So, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think you've got to be in the same room together, having those conversations, right, and being on the same page, right? Because I come from organizing, right, but I'm not organizing right now. I'm organizing, the cities to come and do work together, but I know I'm not the messenger for a lot of spaces anymore. So how do I make sure those folks that are messengers get the right information and the right tools? We're running a fellowship in Louisville and Lexington called the Civic Engagement Fellowship. And it's real intentional. We're taking 20 young men between the ages of 22 and 26 who have had some run-in with the criminal justice system and really putting them in the heart of city government, right? So we took 10 young men in Louisville and 5 in Lexington. And the goal is to say, we want you to be the next generation of public servant leaders, right? Because one, we know you are going to be able to impact policy in a different way because of your life experiences than somebody who just went to school for public policy, right? So these young men are now rotating between different departments with mentors, right? Because we were real clear that they need to find somebody who looks like them inside the city government that work with them and walk with them. But the ultimate goal for us is that cities, we want to change the face of what a city looks like. When I went to work for Mayor Fisher in Louisville, Kentucky, the first thing I realized, one, there's 6,000 jobs that happen inside of city government in Louisville. 6,000 jobs. They wouldn't come in and look for young men that look like me on a regular. And when I got to a director's level, there wasn't that many of them. So how do you be real intentional about creating those pathways? So when we started these fellowships, we were real clear that they were coming in making livable wages. They were going to have health benefits. And again, this is philanthropy. We started this with a Keenan Charitable Trust, which is in North Carolina, but they fund in 4 different states, and Kentucky being one of them. that we wanted to make sure that there were dollars on the table. And what we're asking the cities to do by the third year, so it's a 24-month fellowship. By that third year, you take them on as employees. But they're not just employees, they're on the track to be leaders in government, right? So I want them to be the next director, the next chief of staff, or whatever it is, but you got to be real intentional about that, right? But I couldn't go recruit those kids, right? I had to have some other folks around me, but we were recruiting right out of jail, right? This is like folks who are coming right out of jail up to 6 months of release, because we wanted to be real clear about this. We've been warehousing our talent for way too long. And we can create different pathways if we're intentional and we're thoughtful about it, and we have a continuum. Because in my life, I believe you got to have everybody at the table, right? We got to start being more bridge builders, holding each other accountable, but creating space for all of us. And even when you talk about outreach workers, one of the things that I've been really pushing right now is most of the time folks want interrupters and outreach workers to be part-time, do this on a humble, right? Don't give you no benefits for free. And you've got to be real clear that this is a commitment that folks are making, and you want to pay them livable wages. You want to make sure they have benefit. Then you also want to make sure that we're taking care of their experiences, right? So making sure that they have access to mental health needs and all of that stuff that they need. And if we're really true about organizing, which I love this conversation that Reverend was talking about, is that we got to invest in it. Most cities did not have an organizing structure where they really invested in it and really supported it. And then also create pathways for those organizers to move up the ranks. Because I don't think you organize for life, right? I think you move on to different things. You bring the skills with you into the boardrooms, but I don't think you're on the street organizing and doing outreach, because you got to create space for other folks to come into it too. But I think it's about being intentional and really creating long-term pathways for folks to see what they can be and what their futures could look like, and not be so limited around the gigs and jobs that we tell young people that they can get.
All right, so let me do this because we have time. We only have one question, and then I would like the panelists just to close with a final statement. And I would like you to talk a little bit about what resources that you might be able to offer to organizations and agencies that are here. Just real briefly, you have another chance to network. So this has to be a question. So I'm going to go on top. I'm sorry, Pastor, if you don't mind. We have another chance. We're going to go on top, and we have one question.
Frame it right.
It's a statement, ain't a question.
Okay, this is a statement. So let me give it to the Reverend, if you don't mind, because the Reverend might have a question.
My question is, how are your organizations actually being intentional about including LGBT black men of color? Because we are often the ones who are silenced, but the engines. And so I want to know, what is it that you're doing specifically to privilege us in this conversation?
So thank you for that, Pastor. That's a good question that we have, I've been pushing me and my team to grapple with and get better at. We are not there yet as well as we should be, but we're working with other folks and trying to make sure that we are more inclusive. Because when you talk about, when you say the word black men and boys, you got a vision that pops up into your head. And I think we all need to get better at that. So I appreciate that question and the push and the challenge. So Cities United is not there 100%, but we're really, really working hard to get there, because we know we can't have this conversation if we're not talking about all of us. So that's my roundabout answer to say we're not there yet. So
Anyone else?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about our philanthropic advocacy and support. So we're intentional about investing, particularly in organizing strategies that are Black-led, that are Black, trans, and queer-led. So I referenced the Close the Workhouse campaign, which is very intentional about that intersectional lens. So I think that's part of what we're looking at and looking for. I think also our capacity building work primarily with, and I think we miss this a lot, with folks around unhoused issues. When we talk about young people who are unhoused, we recognize that the number one reason has to do with family dysfunction. The number one leading kind of indicator around that has to do with sexuality, whether that be around LGBTQ issues or around teen pregnancy. That's how our young people, based upon our own lens of respectability, ends up on the streets. And so deep investments in folks who are doing work around unhoused youth, Covenant House, Missouri, one of our longtime capacity building partners, is one of the ways we invest deeply in that work specifically. I'll tell you, though, it's easier for philanthropy to do this in its grant making than it is to do it in its operations and governance. So one of the things that we've been intentional about over the course of the last year is extending the journey from what we push out to what we put in. And so we've got really responsible guides in governance who are convening around this issue to help give life to our kind of public commitment to racial equity, because we recognize that racial equity is by intention and by design intersectional. And so we're seeking to be thoughtful about our growth as it relates to operations and government in as much as we've got it implicated in our investments.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's reflected in our staff at Mentor. It's reflected in who our national partners are organizationally. It's reflected in who was selected in the National Mentoring Summit Fellows, 15 leaders from across the country, and what their identity was and also what their mentoring programs were focused on. And then it's also reflected in a capacity building resource that we're just putting out, a collaboration actually with Big Brothers Big Sisters around helping mentors understand young people who are finding their sexual identity and what that means for them and their gender identity. And just, we're always trying to help adults understand identity in all its contexts. And so we're hoping we can keep doing that with thousands of mentoring programs.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our panel. If you can give me a last closing statement of any additional resources you might be able to offer the agencies and programs in the St. Louis region. So, and your last closing word for us. So we can start first with our Reverend Wilson and then come back to the left.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to remind funders in the context where funders organize and funders advocate is that when we show up, people expect us to bring some money. Our first and deepest resource that I invite people to be thoughtful about is our investment resource. So we provide grants to people who are organizing around the aforementioned 4 issues. We do that with the racial equity lens, and so if you go to deaconess.org, you'll see opportunities for responsive grants, leadership grants, that we can invest in, and capacity building grants and supports that we're providing in the community. We're also very intentional that we built the staff that should go beyond grant making. We believe in a philosophy called trust-based philanthropy, which means you got to do things beyond the grant. So we have consultative supports. We got a really wicked smart staff that gets to go out and help people think through challenging issues. And so that's part of what we have to offer. Our engagement is a part of that. So we talk about the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing. We offer that space to people who are aligning around our public policy agenda and align with our values at no cost. It's a beautiful space. It's the kind of space, I'll tell you, I ain't trying to shade nobody. But this is what I said when we set out to build a space, when we went into the ground with black contractors, with black design build firm. We said we want to build a space that's nicer than the chamber's convening space because the kids' conversations are more important than the Eco Devo conversations they had. And so I say that to say, you know, it's a really nice space with all the AV that anyone needs. And so if you go to deaconesscenter.org, it is a space that we offer to people to convene at no cost. Ain't no fundraising in the space. It's just power building in the space. It's collaboration in the space. So we have that to offer. And then we seek to amplify the voices of our grantees because they're closer to the issues than we are. So we offer, I don't speak in any space. Our Director of Advocacy, Constance Rush, is here. She doesn't speak in any space without echoing what's going on with our grant partners. And so we just seek to amplify the work that others are doing. So we seek to learn about it. We want to give space for that work, and we want to invest in it. So those are the resources we have to offer.
Thank you.
This has been a thoughtful conversation, and thanks for being here. I think right now, just based on the conversation we had, I would love to help organize and support that meeting of mayors and other folks. And be a part of that, and we could bring in some of our other mayors from other places to help them think about how they have looked at the work and guided the work. So I know that's one way we can help. And I think also we would probably, we're going to host our annual convening in Hampton this year. As everybody knows, and I think it was mentioned this morning, there's going to be the recognition of 400 years when the first enslaved African came to America, and Hampton is the port. So there's this conversation, and we're going to be there that same week that they're having that conversation as a state. So it's going to be an interesting week of how you tie that past to the present, how you think about that journey of how we got there. So I would love for you all to think about being in that space with us. So those are the 2 resources we can offer right now. And there's one helping to cultivate that conversation with the mayors, the local mayors, but then 2 also showcasing you all at our convening in August in Hampton as part of that conversation as well.
Yeah, so I'd first just say it's a huge honor and privilege to be with you all, and so impressive what's going on here. Anthony and I were talking about last night, having seen a lot of the plans from different cities. I think, First of all, I'm skeptical. I'm sort of self-skeptical of national. I ran a local, so I always feel like national organizations that sort of wake up in the morning not believing my own BS a little bit. We get to helicopter in and helicopter out. So what I would say is, I think innovation comes from local communities. And so, one, we just want to learn from you. The more you do, the more we can spread throughout the country and we can elevate and others can get better at upholding and making good on this covenant to our boys and young men of color. I also think, we've created lots of resources to sort of empower people in this conversation, make them better at deploying mentoring in a thoughtful and effective way, and in the multiplicity of ways that it can be deployed. We can also look outside of this community and find examples from other places. You have great mentoring leaders here as well, and an incredible mentoring community that's been involved. I think sometimes it does help. It's kind of like looking at something from 10,000 feet. It does help to have people who can come in from out of town and then get out of town, because they can bring people around the table with none of the baggage that sometimes is already in the community, and they can map from the gap. They can say, look, if those wage numbers weren't what they were, if every kid had a mentor, well, then I wouldn't be here. But I'm here because there are things we're trying to solve together, so let's map from the gap. And so I just think there's a certain amount of, I think a certain amount of power that can come from coming into a place and helping people come around a space and table. We're always happy to do that in any community with mentoring, and we're just really privileged to be here with you all and be helpful in any way to the great efforts going on.
Thank you. Let's give thanks to this panel.